present at SAPEX. It was a great experience, wonderful conference, and I can see that Jenny and the team have produced something equally as good in a whole different format and, incredibly challenging situation. So very much looking forward to speaking with you today. I'm just going to share my screen and, oh dear. So let's just undo that. Try again. No. Andrew, I'm going to ask you to assist because I'm seeming to get this very complex picture rather than my screen.
It's tunneling. If you click on the picture again, Deb, what happens? Andrew, any suggestions?
So I have three options: entire screen, application window, and Chrome tab. And when I go into the Chrome tab, okay, I think I will do what I needed to do for John's earlier. So there seems to be a problem with we in Australia and our Google connection. I'm sorry, everyone. Let me tell you what a nice night it is in Australia.
So Deb, if you put your presentation, have you got your presentation open?
Yes.
On slideshow mode? So just have it open, and then if you go to present, and there you go.
Is it there?
As if by magic.
Oh,
it's there.
You just needed to speak, Jenny.
Exactly. And it's full screen. Perfect.
Okay, terrific. Okay. So this first picture is probably how I'm feeling now, and it's also how many of us have been feeling this year. You know, it's been a really rocky time, and but the umbrella is pretty symbolic, I think, of what we've all had to do. We've had to just find ways. We've had to find ways and means, and find a way through it. And we've, in general, done pretty well. The people we've spoken to in supply chain have done some amazing things in all different parts of the world to cope with the very many disruptions they've had in both supply and demand and ports and no air freight and all those different things. But amazingly, they've just discovered ways they didn't know they had of getting through and coping. Our task, though, now, I think, is to transform that umbrella into a big, sturdy sailing ship, cargo-bearing sailing ship, very energy-efficient one at that. And, the sea might settle down a bit, but we are not looking like it's going to be smooth waters for quite a few number of years. So I think our job is to take what we've learned from this situation, to take what we know about the tools that are out there, and to start building out our supply chains. I think we have to take the lessons from this period and we have to build stronger supply chains as a result. So I'm going to quickly look at some views on the strategic priorities for the next 10 years. I'm sure you've all got a bit of a view on that, so you're going to hear my view. And then I'm going to look at two sets of tools, the strategic tools for embedding adaptive capability and resilience, and tactical tools where, it's down to response and it's down to a short time period to do that response. I'm emphasising tools because, we sometimes know what we need to do, but we need a mechanism. We need assistance to help us make decisions, because essentially what we need to do in the next year or two is really make some new decisions. And in the age of sophistication that we are in, it's beholden on us to not just rely on our own experience and our own good sense and all that we've learnt so far, but to actually turn to the tools that are available and combine them with our knowledge to make better decisions. So my take on the priorities for the next 10 years or so are these. I think we are clearly going to have to understand what builds resilience, and to build it into our operations, not only for black swan events, as John Gatorna mentioned this morning, but for business as usual as well, because there's a lot more variability in business as usual, even up until now. And going forward, we can expect that it will not be as smooth even as the last 10 years. The second point is adaptability, and a lot of people think about those as the same thing. I don't. I think they're two different things. I think adaptability is basically being able to change direction, whereas resilience is more about being able to bounce back and being able to look after current customers in current markets and current business. Adaptability is the changes, the big changes in direction, particularly in demand, and we in many countries will go into a recessionary demand period now. It's changing customer expectations. We were on a trend towards short, smaller, faster deliveries, and COVID has only enhanced that. We know that we were facing in our traditional industries many new business models are emerging and competing, often what we'd call disintermediation, taking out one of the middle parties in a channel, and we are all painfully aware of the geopolitical shifts that we are in the midst of. And then there's a sustainability agenda. Now, this is not new. We've lived in this situation for some time. I think the difference is that the big end of town is getting serious. The investors are getting serious. The mining companies in Australia are all feeling the pressure from investors. We can see the big oil companies are starting to feel investor pressure. So, follow the money. The money is saying it's time for this to change. Now, whether governments lead it or not, we see that there's a consensus among those who are making some of the very biggest investment decisions that something has to change. And we in the supply chain are really front and centre in sustainability. You think of the many, many areas that we touch and how common it is that we are the ones that are making decisions that either impact emissions or impact our social impact in our supply base. So let's think about some of the strategic tools and the mindsets that go with it. Now, some of these aren't new, but I'd like you to think about them in a slightly different way. And the way I'd like you to think about them is in terms of design. So I see these decisions regarding resilience, adaption, and sustainability are all ultimately design decisions. And I see the strategy role in the supply chain as a design role. I mean, it's a very significant part of what we do, and we often overlook how much we are actually designing the future. The decisions we make is what designs the future. So to do well at design in a supply chain context, I think there's 3 layers to it. Firstly, there needs to be very clear internal clarity around priorities. If sustainability is not a high priority to the executive and to the board, then it's not part of the design decision. If it's a high priority, but it's also competing with a cost priority or a margin priority or a resilience priority, and increasingly that will be, even at the board level, coming through as a high priority, then we've got to understand how to weigh them up. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about that as we go on. The second part of it is experience, which to me is judgment. It's making that final call. But I've got that in the middle because the other component are tools to test options. And I think we've really moved past the stage where we just rely on experience. And this is what I'd like to speak more about. So addressing the resilience topic, there are a number of levers. And as we all continue to communicate about this broad resilience topic and think about, what we might do differently, there's, really quite a large number of choices. The question is, what is the combination of those choices that are going to fit the current priorities of the business? We look at one end, on the sourcing end, and it's, become quite stark where we've had that concentration of sourcing, where we've been overly dependent on one region or even one country. And it's clear that those sort of decisions need to be probably rethought. We also see in that combination that, over-reliance on one supplier, or at least one supply city even, and these sort of decisions are now looking like quite risky decisions. And so this diversity of supply comes into play. We also think about, combining different types of suppliers, collaborating with one supplier of a material with an agile supplier to be the one that gives the flex. And so I won't go across all of these, but, there's much written about some of the options for improving resilience. The trick is that we can't use all of them. We know that our resources are limited. We know we might be able to build some more buffer in, but we know that we can't build buffers all the way along the chain. And because that is going to be expensive, and two, it may not achieve our highest priorities. So it is a fairly complex question as to where we build in resilience. So, 10 years ago or more, when I last presented at SAPEX, I did talk about network modelling, and I'm talking about it again, because when it comes to strategic choices, I think it's the key tool. It allows us to test options. It allows us to depict complex networks and capture them in one place. It allows us to take a distribution centre out and see what the impact is on cost or service. And it allows us to, put new facilities in and test what difference they make, and all the time understanding what the cost impact or the service impact is. So for strategic decisions on embedding resilience, I still think it's the go-to first port of call. And from that time way back when I did present at SAPEX, what is possible and what's sensible to use these sort of models for has changed. And I think, they're underutilised for anything beyond the cost question. Most models are still run to minimise cost, to create a network of least cost. Now, I think that's wholly inadequate now. There is so much more we can do. We particularly now can look at risk and resilience alternatives. We can certainly look at sustainability alternatives. And we're not going to talk so much about them today, but things like omni-channel and how best to service an omni-channel fulfillment problem, how we can enhance our marketing efforts in different segments of segments of our market, and alternative sourcing options, and how to get more value out of sourcing are all very good questions. But let's talk a little bit more about the sort of risk and resilience type. This is how we test big shifts like major surges in demand. What would happen if we had a major surge in demand and, we had PPE, early in the year as our major point of focus? And, how would we handle that if we were a supplier of that product? How would we, if we were a government, handle a major surge in demand for some of the pharmaceuticals that we are expected to stockpile? How do we handle major drops in demand? Because, it's one thing to understand how to surge, but it's another thing to understand what to do and how to contract the network effectively for a drop in demand. And then sourcing risks such as outages of strategic suppliers and regional port disruptions are the sort of things we can also look at. Now, one important finding that David Simchi-Levy, who's has written some excellent material in this space, and certainly has been the same with the projects that I've been involved in, both in Hong Kong and in other parts of the world and in Australia, is that there is this flat point. When you start to test out some of these scenarios, what you notice is that when you're testing number of distribution centres or number of factories, you tend to get this flat spot around the optimal. Now, that's very, very important when we start to think about resilience, because we tend to focus on what's the very best solution. And in this, for example, the very best solution might be 8 distribution centres. But then again, it's only a very small increase in cost if we were to carry 10. And so the lower risk option is certainly, in this situation would be the 10 option, even though the optimal might point you lower. And that's that flat spot is very consistent, but often, not explored. The other great advantage of the sophisticated models now is the ability to model emissions at the same time as modelling cost, so that you can look at options such as, what is the least cost network, but then you can also understand, well, what is the impact of that network on carbon emissions or CO2 emissions, and also test CO2 scenarios to say, well, if we minimise, what would be the impact on cost? And you'll see the results of this was a study that we did looking at an Asian fashion network, and you can see here that the lowest cost was a minus 27% reduction, and really it was not that sensitive. Emissions were not that sensitive, except for the option that yielded only 20%, which increased emissions by 12%. So this sort of looking at these two dimensions at the same time can be very useful. Some work that we find very interesting has started to emerge around looking at multiple goals. And here, in this study, we would have run those models with those two things, but we were solving for cost. So if we wanted a CO2 scenario, we had to abandon it and run it for CO2 first and just see a cost result. This work looks at multiple goals and says, well, you can solve for each one, but then by weighting them, you can start to look at them together and run them all together and try and get the best result for all of them, but within the context of the weighting. And the future is probably going to be more of thinking in this way, because basically that's how I think, but anyway, that the supply chain is going to evolve. This was a very, very large model that was built for one of the states in Australia that has very high grain shipping. So they have 4 ports, operate 200 storage sites across the state. And this was solved for cost, but with a risk constraint. And the risk was about harvest risk. How quickly could you get the harvest into storage so safe from rain and weather events, how quickly could you get it in and minimise cost at the same time? So we veered between those two big objectives. And so the end network had a very considerable reduction in storage, but a very considerable investment in fast handling equipment to turn trucks around quickly at the sites that did stay. So it was a hybrid solution that solved for both risk and cost. Now, if we're not just doing a modelling exercise, it may well be that we can just do a mapping exercise, because increasingly we're seeing that mapping of supply locations and mapping of key vulnerabilities is very instructive all on its own, and some excellent work being done in various places on this theme. This is some work being done in Australia with our Commonwealth's CSIRO, which is a government-funded body that supports our industry, and they are looking at, they are mapping some of our major agricultural and mining supply chains, and they are looking at climate shocks and climate risk, and they're assessing where the vulnerabilities are and thus where investment should be focused. But one of the interesting side findings of this was that they're finding that the more complex supply chains consistently are more resilient than simple supply chains in multiple shock scenarios. So we would often think that a simpler supply chain is better and easier to manage. This interesting finding suggests that sometimes complexity is good, mainly because there are a lot of options, either a lot of demand options, supply options, or a lot of routes in the middle and ways to get your product to market. And this idea of mapping risk and then putting an index on it is also an important piece of work that's emerging in the last few years. And this is a very good way, we think, of looking at it, because it's called the Risk Exposure Index. And it looks at, doesn't try and pick up probability. It looks at the time to recover, and that's and poor performance impact. So if it takes 2 weeks to recover and there will be a revenue impact of 2.5 billion, well, that might be your highest risk. Whereas down here with a 1 week to recover and only $100 million impact, that's got a much lower index. So this idea of indexing risk can be very powerful, because it allows you to prioritise focus, prioritise investment, and prioritise, how you deal with suppliers. So now moving on to tactical tools and capabilities. You notice last time we said strategic tools and mindsets, and here we're talking about tactical tools and capabilities. John Gatorna mentioned this and used this slide this morning, and we think these are some really, really important digital elements that are going to significantly enhance our ability to respond and to adapt in the future. So being able to see and understand where product is at any one point in time, being able to understand who has responsibility for it, so the chain of custody, being able to monitor external risks, being able to sense shifts in demand as quickly as possible, analytics to understand true demand and segment needs, and tactical scenario testing and ready to run. And I want to speak particularly about this and this last one about control towers. So control towers, we're hearing that terminology. When we use it, we're talking very, very specifically about this sort of situation where there is a team who are charged with monitoring and keeping track of all movements in particular part of the supply chain, and making very quick decisions when there's deviations. We think that this has been the most important development in many ways in the last 10 years, and it will be the base for that extra piece of resilience as we move forward. This is the Schneider Electric Control Tower in Sydney. I think they have about 7 now across the world, and they've had huge success in improving their customer service levels and customer satisfaction just by, through this one mechanism. They use, and many other companies are starting to use, risk monitoring software that gives them real-time insight into unexpected events, and we think these are incredibly valuable to support. But it's no value to have a risk monitoring if you've got no mechanism for making fast decisions in response. And then we'd like to, then sort of think about that network model again, because going back to that capability, if we've built a model of a large part of the network or a significant part of the network, the other thing that it gives us is a tactical capability if we can make sure that it's up to date. And I think this was one of the, we wrote a paper about this early on in COVID, and some of the people we've worked with over the years to develop models are now starting to think about how they can do this, how they can turn their strategic model into a tactical model so that they can quickly test options when these unforeseen events happen. And this is, we think, one of the areas that those kind of teams can really focus in on, and getting to the stage of a ready-to-run capability where they can bring the model up to date very quickly and then turn it into a scenario testing for disruption. What it allows you to do then is to test some, when you don't know what is going to happen, and all of us have had trouble forecasting in this period. What it allows you to do is then test a range of forecasts and get a range of options so that, that those charged with making these decisions at least can see a spectrum. And we saw this in the medical field, certainly in Australia, and I suspect in many countries, there we would often be seeing a spectrum of scenarios, not just one. And for decisions with uncertainty, this can be very valuable. The other piece that John Katorna mentioned this morning that I wanted to follow up on a little bit more is this idea of a fully flexible capability as a parallel, what we'd call a supply chain. So, it might only be 5 people in a room, but its job is to treat those unexpected events, to treat new product launches, for example, as well as disruption, and be very good at doing different things, having the ability to think and operate freely, not be overly constrained by systems, not be overly constrained by current relationships, certainly have the contingency or prequel kind of plan worked out, but also have these tools to be able to test alternatives and the authority or mandate to get involved with new arrangements very quickly when needed. And we think that this kind of capability is going to be very, very important as we go into this next stage that's not quite stable but not quite as volatile as it's been. But, if we're going to learn to turn our umbrella into a big sturdy sailing cargo vessel, then I think these are the kind of things we're going to have to think about. So this kind of capability would be deployed, maybe for new channels, maybe for new launches, but certainly in terms of natural disasters and emergencies or supply collapses. And the important thing is the capability. Generally this is not the world of process. This is the world where people are empowered to make decisions. Creativity and innovation and new solutions are valued. Cost is not the KPI. It's very people-driven rather than systems-driven. And it can be built into a specialist type of capability. And the other piece to it is that, we haven't spent a lot of time studying risks and probability in a day-to-day kind of sense. And I think if we had, one team focused in this area, that could be part of their brief. So to finish up, we've another picture that sort of resonated with me during this time is this one that, it's been pretty dark, but we've got to kind of emerge from here with some insight and some new direction. And, I think our task is very clearly to emerge with stronger supply chains. And to me, stronger supply chains are those that are not only more resilient, but they can change direction if needed. And that they certainly lead the way in terms of sustainability. I think none of us will feel our conscience is satisfied if we don't get on with that in the next 10 years.
Thanks, Deborah. That was incredibly interesting. Please, people in the audience, please put your questions into the discussion for Deborah. We do have about 13 minutes remaining. I have one immediate question. It seems to me, and this is something I've seen many clients grappling with, is change in paradigm that is required for this type of thinking. Which brings me to the question of what do you think the impact of an organization's culture is in being able to adopt some of this thinking?
It's very, very important. The culture that only values procedure, precedent, and safety is going to struggle in the coming years. Basically, we need more than one culture. We need to have an underpinning culture that says, in general, who we are, but then a suite of cultures or a number of subcultures that allow us to do different things in different ways. We need some parts of our culture and our people to be aligned with our collaborative customers and keeping those relationships sound, and with our collaborative suppliers and spending the time and engaging with them. But we also need another subculture that allows us to spin and change direction and innovate, and another subculture that allows us to make quick, hard decisions and be very agile. And, without large organisations particularly, it's just too restricting to say this is all we are, this is our culture, and this is what we're good at, and leave it at that. We need to be more versatile than that.
So do you think that there's a case for almost a jack of all trades mentality to a certain extent then?
No, I don't think so. I think that it's too hard for us to be, as an organisation or as individuals, a jack of all trades. So, I think we do need a set of different capabilities that, or teams of people that are focused in different ways, and that they have a culture of agility, or they have a culture of flexibility, and whereas some other team has a culture of collaboration and another with lean. It's too difficult to be the jack of all trades.
Agreed. I have a question here from Fatima. What are the first 3 steps to take to supply chain?
I'm sorry, you're just breaking up there, Andrew. Could you repeat?
What are the first 3 steps? What are the first 3 steps to take to build a more resilient supply chain?
The 3 steps, I would look at is I'd certainly be looking at understanding what I've got in terms of current network. I think very, very often our current network is hidden in the minds of, 45 people. And we don't often, we've always started a project by doing a one-page map, whether it's a multinational or where it's a national company, a one-page map that actually draws the connections out and the major pieces, and then breaking that down and looking at it more closely in other areas. But by understanding clearly what the as is, I think there's the first step, and to understand where the buffers are and how much stock lives in various locations, including in our channels, I think is the first step. And then understanding, from a customer's end what they experience from us and where we're vulnerable. So, that mapping piece and also on the supply side. So I'd say they're the steps, but then I would, if it's a large network, I would then turn to modelling to really be able to test it and understand where else we could build in resistance and resilience.
Great, thank you. I've got one more question. What tools do you recommend in doing that supply chain mapping? I mean, are things like the SCORE model relevant for this type of exercise?
I don't find them as relevant. I find that just the using and combining the experience of the team and and drawing it out in a physical sense. The networks are very much, supply chains are very much nodes and links, and then deposits of inventory at nodes. So to me, that is always a first step to draw it out and understand it. And then, of course, the other tools come in like value chain mapping and SCORE. But to understand the sort of flows overall, I think is a very useful first step. And then the tools that the various software companies use to depict a network can be very useful as well.
Okay, and I'm aware of. I'm also aware of there's a few risk alert systems out there as well. Do you recommend the use of those types of tools?
Yes, we've been pretty impressed by we've only I've only seen in action the DHL 360 resilience tool, and it seems to turn up everywhere we go. It seems to be the go-to tool. I'm sure there's others. I'm sure other people can tell me others, but I've only keep coming across that one. But that seems to have been very successful in achieving its goal of creating those alerts.
Yeah. Great. If there's no more questions, I'll close out the session. Thank you very much, Deborah. Extremely interesting talk, very practical as well. Before the audience moves on, please go into the poll and rate the speaker from 5 to 1. So 5 being excellent, 1 being expected better. And then if you would like to speak to Deborah, she will be available in the VIP room, although she may not be because it's quite late in Australia now. But you can message her from the VIP room if you'd like to have a chat at some point. Thanks, everybody. Please enjoy the rest of the conference. Please visit the booths and network as much as possible. That's what we're here for. Thanks very much, Deborah.
Thanks, Andrew. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Jenny. Bye-bye.